In early 1945, as World War II in the Pacific approached its climax, a small but strategically important patch of land became the center of attention. Iwo Jima, or Sulphur Island, as it was also called, was just 8 square miles of volcanic rock, lost in the vast expanses of the Pacific Ocean. However, its location made it invaluable. It was located approximately 660 miles south of Tokyo, which made it an ideal staging ground for American B-29 bombers conducting raids on the Japanese islands. For Japan, Iwo Jima was the last bastion of defense, the key to protecting the homeland. The battle for this island became one of the bloodiest and most ferocious in human history, a symbol of unyielding will and incredible sacrifice. Now that we understand Iwo Jima's geographical location, let's delve into why this speck of land became such a coveted target for the Americans and why the Japanese were willing to fight for it to the last man. By early 1945, the war in the Pacific had become a methodical, bloody advance of American forces towards the Japanese home islands. Iwo Jima, located 660 miles from Tokyo, lay directly in the path of B-29 bombers flying from the Mariana Islands. These giant machines, bringing death to Japanese cities, faced serious problems. Their route passed through the operational zone of Japanese fighters based on Iwo Jima. These fighters not only intercepted bombers, but also transmitted information about the approaching American aircraft, giving the Japanese precious time to prepare their anti-aircraft defenses. The capture of Iwo Jima would mean neutralizing this threat, opening a clear sky for American B-29s. But that was just the beginning. In addition to its function as an aircraft carrier, Iwo Jima was a real lifeline for damaged bombers. Hundreds of American crews, damaged over Japan, could not return to the Mariana Islands and were forced to ditch or crash. The island, with its 3 airfields, could become an intermediate base for refueling and repairs, saving not only planes but also thousands of pilots' lives. By some estimates, Iwo Jima could have saved up to 2,400 bombers and 24,000 crew members. Think about it, a huge number of people and equipment that could have been lost, but would have gotten a chance at salvation thanks to this small island. Furthermore, Iwo Jima was necessary as an advanced staging ground for the upcoming operation to capture Okinawa, the last major barrier before the invasion of the Japanese home islands. From Iwo Jima, air cover and logistical support could be provided for forces heading to Okinawa, significantly reducing flight time and increasing the effectiveness of operations. For the Americans, the capture of Iwo Jima was not just a tactical move. It was a strategic imperative that was meant to significantly accelerate the end of the war in the Pacific. For the Japanese command, Iwo Jima was no less important, but for completely different reasons. It was an integral part of their defensive line. The loss of Iwo Jima would mean that the enemy was in close proximity to the homeland, that bombings would become even more intense and accurate, and that the threat of invasion of the Japanese home islands themselves would become real. The Japanese understood that Iwo Jima was not just an island. It was the last frontier before the sacred land of their homeland. They were determined to hold it at all costs, turning it into an impregnable fortress, every stone of which was to become a grave for the enemy. That is why General Kuribayashi, who was to command the defense of Iwo Jima, received orders to fight to the last man, expecting no reinforcements and counting on no evacuation. Iwo Jima was to become a place where the Americans would pay the highest price for every inch of land, to break their morale and slow their advance toward Japan. This was a confrontation where the strategic interests of both sides intersected at one seemingly insignificant point on the map of the Pacific Ocean, turning it into the arena of one of the bloodiest battles in history. Now that we understand why Iwo Jima became a battlefield, let's move to the headquarters of the American command, where the plan for this grand and bloody operation was born. Preparation for the capture of Sulphur Island began long before the landing, in the offices of Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and General Garland Smith, commander of the Marine Corps Expeditionary Forces. These were the men on whose shoulders lay the colossal responsibility for the lives of thousands of soldiers and the success of the entire Pacific campaign. Their task was to assemble not just an army, but a true fist capable of breaking through Japanese defenses. And they did it. For Operation Detachment, this was the name of the battle for Iwo Jima, the entire U.S. Fifth Fleet was mobilized, one of the most powerful naval formations in history. Its composition is impressive. Over 490 ships, including 18 aircraft carriers, 8 battleships, 15 cruisers, and 77 destroyers. This was a floating fortress, capable of providing fire support, air cover, and logistics for thousands of Marines. 10,000 crew members commanded these steel giants. The main striking force of the operation fell on the shoulders of 3 Marine Corps divisions, the 3rd, 4th, and 5th. In total, about 70,000 Marines were to land on Iwo Jima. These were battle-hardened veterans who had gone through the atolls and islands of the Pacific. But even they did not imagine what they would have to face. Air support was also unprecedented. In addition to aircraft from aircraft carriers, B-29 bombers participated in the operation, which were to deliver preliminary strikes against Japanese positions. Intelligence played a key role. The Americans meticulously gathered information about Iwo Jima, using aerial photography and radio interception data. They knew that the Japanese had fortified the island, but the scale of these fortifications remained a mystery. Photographs showed a dense network of trenches, bunkers, and artillery positions. However, the underground labyrinths and tunnels created by General Kuribayashi remained invisible to American eyes. This became one of the most fatal intelligence miscalculations. American analysts, based on the available data, believed that there were about 13,000 Japanese soldiers on the island. This estimate turned out to be erroneous. In reality, the Iwo Jima garrison numbered almost 21,000 men. This underestimation led to the American command not fully realizing the full complexity of the upcoming operation. They expected heavy fighting, but did not assume that every inch of the island would have to be won with such incredible tenacity and such sacrifices. Despite some gaps in intelligence, the Americans were confident in their numerical and technical superiority. They were ready for an assault that, they hoped, would last only a few days. But reality turned out to be much harsher and longer. In early June 1944, the Japanese command realized the inevitability of an American landing on Iwo Jima, and so Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi was appointed to the island. This was an unusual choice. Kuribayashi, a graduate of the Imperial Army War College with experience serving in the USA and Canada, perfectly understood the power of the American war machine. He was not a typical Japanese officer, fanatically adhering to dogma. Kuribayashi thought outside the box, and it was precisely this that saved thousands of Japanese lives, if not from death, then from senseless demise in the first minutes of the landing. His strategy was revolutionary for the Japanese army. He abandoned the traditional tactics of coastal defense, which involved confronting the enemy directly on the beaches. Kuribayashi knew that the massive fire from American ships and aircraft would turn such a defense into a bloody slaughter in a matter of minutes. Instead, He ordered his soldiers to retreat deep into the island and create a deeply echeloned defense system. The main task was not to repel the landing, but to maximally delay the American advance, wear them down, and force them to pay an incredibly high price for every meter of land. Kuribayashi perfectly understood that there would be no reinforcements and evacuation was impossible. His garrison was doomed, but he wanted this doom to become the worst nightmare for the enemy. Under his leadership, Iwo Jima was transformed into a true labyrinth of death. Over 18 kilometers of tunnels were dug into the volcanic rock, connecting bunkers, firing positions, command posts, and warehouses. These tunnels were wide enough to move troops and ammunition, and their numerous exits were carefully disguised. The walls of the bunkers, many of which were built using cement, sand, and volcanic ash, were up to 5 meters thick, capable of withstanding direct hits from heavy shells. Inside these fortifications were machine gun nests, artillery batteries, anti-tank guns, and mortars. In total, over 5,000 separate fortifications were built on the island, each western representing a deadly trap. Firing positions were arranged to provide crossfire and create killing zones into which advancing Americans would fall. Kuribayashi personally inspected the construction, demanding maximum stealth and effectiveness. He ordered the fortifications to be built in such a way that they were invisible from the sea and air, using the natural landscape and camouflage nets. In the northern part of the island, especially around Mount Suribachi, the most powerful defensive structures were created, including underground hospitals and food supplies designed for months of siege. This strategy was so innovative that many Japanese officers initially resisted it, accustomed to traditional banzai attacks and suicidal coastal defenses. But Kuribayashi was unyielding. He forbade any attacks without his personal order, understanding that counterattacks would only weaken the garrison and lead to unnecessary losses. His goal was not to win, but to prolong the battle to the limit, so that every day of American advance was paid for with blood and suffering. He wanted Iwo Jima to become a symbol of the unbroken spirit of the Japanese soldier, even in the face of imminent defeat. And he succeeded in this, creating a defense that struck the Americans with its cruelty and ingenuity. Finally, the morning of February 19, 1945, arrived. After months of planning and weeks of waiting, the American fleet, like a steel monster, surrounded Iwo Jima. With dawn, hell began. Even before the landing, the island was shaken by the most powerful artillery bombardment in the history of the Pacific War. Thousands of shells rained down on Japanese positions, raising columns of volcanic ash and smoke into the air. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, all ships capable of firing, turned Iwo Jima into a blazing crater. They were followed by hundreds of planes from aircraft carriers, dropping bombs and shelling suspected Japanese fortifications. It seemed that nothing living could withstand such a barrage of fire. The American command was confident that the Japanese defense would be completely suppressed. At 9 o'clock in the morning, after 3 hours of continuous bombardment, the first waves of Marines began to land on the black volcanic beaches at the foot of Mount Suribachi. Huge landing craft, filled with soldiers and equipment, slowly moved towards the shore. The Marines expected fierce resistance, but the first minutes were quiet, unexpectedly quiet. The landing parties jumped out of the boats, making their way through the loose volcanic sand that sucked at their feet, making movement difficult. Equipment got stuck in it, turning the beach into a chaotic cluster of machines. And all this time, silence. Not a single shot, not a single flash. This eerie silence was far more terrifying than the fiercest battle. It indicated that General Kuribayashi had no intention of following the American script. He adhered to his strategy. Let the enemy land, let them advance deep into the island, let them feel a false sense of calm. And then, finally, when the American Marines had advanced several tens of meters inland, the Japanese counterattacked from thousands of invisible bunkers, from the depths of tunnels, from camouflaged firing points. As if from underground, a hail of fire erupted. Mortars, machine guns, artillery, all of it rained down on the heads of the landing parties, caught in the open, without cover. The beaches, which a minute ago seemed safe, turned into a fiery trap. Snipers, entrenched in the mountains, methodically picked off officers and communications personnel. The Marines found themselves in a veritable meat grinder. Moving through the loose ash was impossible. Every step was difficult, and it also absorbed explosions, preventing craters from forming behind which one could take cover. It was like quicksand, in which not only equipment, but also human will got bogged down. The first serious casualties began to accumulate at an alarming rate. Dozens, hundreds of Marines fell under invisible fire. The evacuation of the wounded was extremely difficult. Many of them remained lying on the beach, awaiting help under relentless fire. This day was a shock to the American command. They expected resistance, but not such ingenuity and such tenacity. General Kuribayashi demonstrated that his strategy worked. He turned Iwo Jima into a deadly trap, where every inch of land had to be won at the cost of blood and lives. The Battle of Iwo Jima had just begun, and this first day made it clear that it would be one of the most terrible and bloody in history. After the shock of the first day, when the Americans suffered enormous losses on the beaches, it became clear the key to success lay in capturing Mount Suribachi. This was not just a hilltop on the southern tip of Iwo Jima. It was a dormant volcano bristling with firing positions, underground casemates, and tunnels. From its summit, the Japanese could sweep the entire southern part of the island, including the landing beaches. As long as Suribachi remained in Japanese hands, any advance was suicidal. The task of assaulting this impregnable fortress fell to the 5th Marine Division. For 5 days, from February 19th to 23rd, some of the fiercest battles in the history of the Marine Corps unfolded. Every meter of ground was paid for with blood. The Marines advanced slowly, step by step, using flamethrowers, grenades, and dynamite to root out the Japanese from their deep fortifications. Fighting took place not only on the surface, but also underground, in a tangled network of tunnels where every turn could conceal an ambush. Japanese soldiers, following General Kuribayashi's orders, fought to the last, refusing to surrender. Their tenacity and ingenuity in defense were astounding. They used every fold of the terrain, every crevice, to set up an ambush or a machine gun nest. American tanks, despite their power, often proved helpless against disguised anti-tank guns and mines. However, the Marines displayed no less tenacity and heroism. They crawled forward under heavy fire, clearing the way with explosives and flamethrowers. One of the key tactics was the use of assault teams, consisting of engineers with backpack flamethrowers and sappers, who cleared enemy fortifications meter by meter. Their actions were incredibly dangerous, but it was precisely these actions that allowed them to break through the Japanese defenses. On February 23, 1945, after 4 days of continuous fighting, a small patrol of 40 men, led by Lieutenant Harold Schreier, ascended to the summit of Suribachi. After clearing the summit of the last pockets of resistance, they raised a small American flag attached to a water pipe. This was the first flag raised on Iwo Jima, and it was seen by all soldiers on the island and on the ships. A historic moment that boosted morale but was not captured. Several hours later, by order of the battalion commander, It was decided to replace this flag with a larger one, so that it would be visible to the entire fleet. It was this second flag that became the symbol of the Battle of Iwo Jima. 6 Marines, Sergeant Michael Strank, Corporal Harlan Block, Privates First Class Franklin Sousley, Ira Hayes, Harold Schultz, and Harold Keller, raised the flag on the mountaintop. At that moment, photographer Joe Rosenthal, working for the Associated Press Agency, took his famous photograph. He happened to be at the top of the mountain and managed to capture that moment. The photograph instantly spread around the world, becoming an icon of the battle, a symbol of the U.S. Marine Corps, and one of the most recognizable images of World War II. It became a powerful propaganda tool, inspiring Americans and demonstrating the determination of their soldiers. Joe Rosenthal's photograph, for which he received the Pulitzer Prize, immortalized the heroism of these 6 Marines. However, of the 6 who raised the flag, 3 died in subsequent fighting for the island. Their names, like the names of all who fought on Iwo Jima, are forever etched in history. The capture of Suribachi, despite the jubilation, did not mean the end of the battle. It was only the first step, opening the way to further, even bloodier battles for the 3 airfields located in the center of the island. The capture of Mount Suribachi, though a powerful symbol and a morale booster, was merely the first act in this bloody drama. The main objective of the operation, the true prize, lay in the center of the island, 3 Japanese airfields. It was for these that the fiercest battles were yet to unfold. The Marines had to traverse the entire island from south to north, inch by inch, gnawing away at Japanese positions. This was not an offensive, but a methodical, exhausting cleanup, where every bunker, every cave became a separate fortress. Japanese soldiers, following General Kuribayashi's strategy, did not offer massive resistance in open terrain. Instead, they hid in their underground fortifications, waiting for the moment for a sudden attack or a precise shot. Progress was agonizingly slow, measured in tens and sometimes even single meters per day. The Americans encountered a defensive system unseen before. Every hill, every elevation was riddled with machine gun nests, artillery positions hidden in the rocks, and mortar crews capable of unleashing a hail of fire on the advancing troops. The walls of the bunkers, up to 5 meters thick, withstood direct hits from naval artillery and aerial bombs. Against such fortifications, a conventional infantry attack would have been suicide. The Americans quickly realized that traditional combat methods did not work here. They began to employ a new tactic, which became the hallmark of Iwo Jima. Assault teams, consisting of engineer sappers armed with flamethrowers and explosives, became the main strike force. Flamethrowers, spewing streams of napalm up to 40 meters, became the most effective weapon against Japanese pillboxes and bunkers. They not only burned the enemy out of their shelters, but also created unbearable conditions inside, burning up oxygen and causing suffocation. Tanks, especially those equipped with flamethrowers, became indispensable. They, under the cover of infantry, approached the fortifications closely, burning them from the inside. However, even tanks were not invulnerable. The Japanese, using anti-tank rifles, magnetic mines, and even suicide bombers with explosive charges, inflicted serious damage on them. Artillery, both naval and field, worked non-stop, but its effectiveness against deeply echeloned underground defenses was limited. Shells only destroyed surface fortifications, leaving the enemy's main positions untouched. The Japanese, in turn, showed incredible ingenuity. They used cunning traps, minefields, and also launched sudden counterattacks from underground exits, attacking the Americans from the rear or flanks. The battles for the airfields were particularly bloody. The first airfield, located in the southern part of the island, was captured by February 23rd, but it took weeks of fierce fighting to fully secure it. The second and third airfields, located further north, were even more heavily fortified and became the arena of the most desperate clashes. Every meter of land was paid for with dozens of lives. American Marines, despite fatigue and enormous losses, continued to stubbornly advance, step by step, steadily approaching the northern tip of the island, where, as they knew, even fiercer resistance awaited them. The capture of the airfields, it would seem, should have meant the end of the battle. But on Iwo Jima, everything was different. The Marines quickly realized that the most terrible part of the battle was just beginning, and this part was called underground warfare. General Kuribayashi, as if foreseeing the future, turned the island into a giant anthill, where under every stone, under every embankment, deadly traps were hidden. The total length of the Japanese tunnels was more than 18 kilometers. Imagine that figure, 18 kilometers of underground passages, labyrinths, bunkers, and barracks dug into solid volcanic rock. It was an entire underground empire, invisible from the surface, but deadly dangerous to anyone who dared to step on the ground above it. The tunnels were designed to provide Japanese soldiers with maximum protection from artillery shelling and air raids. They were wide enough to move troops, ammunition, and even light artillery through them. Hundreds, if not thousands of exits, carefully camouflaged and located in the most unexpected places, allowed the Japanese to emerge from underground, strike suddenly, and disappear before the Americans could orient themselves. It was a war against an invisible enemy. The Marines, advancing, never knew where the next blow would come from. Yesterday's seemingly cleared area could again be under Japanese control as they quietly emerged from their underground shelters. Every step was fraught with risk. Every cover could turn out to be a disguised firing point. The Americans faced an unprecedented tactic that required new, no less ingenious solutions. Fighting this underground threat became the main task. The Marines developed methods that later became classics of anti-bunker warfare. Flamethrowers, grenades, and explosives became the main tools. Flamethrowers, spewing streams of napalm, were a terrifying but extremely effective weapon. They not only burned the Japanese out of the tunnels, but also created unbearable conditions inside. High temperature, lack of oxygen, smoke, and soot. The smoke and heat from burning napalm penetrated deep into the underground labyrinths, forcing the Japanese either to come to the surface, where American machine guns awaited them, or to suffocate in their shelters. Using flamethrowers was an incredibly dangerous undertaking. Flamethrower operators became priority targets for Japanese snipers and machine gunners, but their heroism was indispensable. Grenades, especially phosphorus ones, were also widely used to clear tunnels and caves. Their explosions and caustic smoke made it impossible to stay inside. Marines threw grenades into every detected entrance, into every crevice, hoping to destroy or at least disorient the enemy. Explosives, dynamite, and TNT were used to blast bunkers and collapse tunnels. Engineer sappers, often under heavy fire, mined the entrances to the underground passages and then detonated them, sealing the Japanese inside. It was a slow, methodical, and extremely dangerous process. The Marines worked in close cooperation with tanks, which, equipped with flamethrowers, could approach fortifications closely and burn them out. Often, tank crews used their guns to punch holes in bunker walls and then pour napalm through these holes. The psychological impact of such warfare was colossal. American soldiers were constantly tense, knowing that at any moment, an invisible enemy could emerge from underground. The feeling of constant threat, the inability to see the enemy, fighting in confined spaces. All this put enormous pressure on the psyche. Many Marines suffered from so-called tunnel claustrophobia, where the very thought of descending into dark, narrow passages caused panic. They saw their comrades disappearing into these gloomy labyrinths and did not know if they would return alive. For the Japanese soldiers, trapped in this underground prison, the psychological pressure was no less. They fought to the last, knowing that death was inevitable. The lack of sunlight, the constant smell of gunpowder and soot, the incessant explosions and screams. All this turned the underground shelters into a real hell. They were cut off from the outside world, without hope of salvation, fighting for every meter of their underground fortress. The underground war on Iwo Jima became one of the most chilling and unique aspects of this battle, demonstrating both the incredible tenacity of the Japanese and the ingenuity and resilience of the American Marines, who had to adapt to completely new combat conditions. On Iwo Jima, where every inch of land was soaked in blood and every day brought new challenges, the issue of rescuing the wounded was particularly acute. In such a meat grinder, the work of medical units turned into a true feat. Medics, doctors, nurses, all of them operated at the limits of human capabilities, often under intense fire, risking their own lives to give a chance of survival to those who fell in battle. The system for evacuating the wounded from Iwo Jima was one of the most complex and well-organized in Marine Corps history. With each wave of the landing, not only soldiers but also medical teams disembarked onto the beaches. Their task was to provide first aid directly on the front line, stabilize the condition of the wounded, and prepare them for further transport. In the initial days, when the beaches were under constant shelling, this was tantamount to suicide. Medics, or as the Marines called them, docs, crawled through the black volcanic ash to reach the wounded. They bandaged wounds, stopped bleeding, administered painkillers, often using their bodies as shields against bullets. Many of them died or were wounded, but their selflessness saved thousands of lives. After receiving first aid, the wounded were moved to field hospitals, located directly behind the front line, often in hastily dug out dugouts or tents. Here, doctors performed more complex operations, preparing patients for evacuation. Then, under the cover of night or during brief lulls between battles, the wounded were taken to the beaches. From the beaches, they were loaded onto landing craft, which then transported them to hospital ships waiting offshore. These ships were true floating hospitals, equipped with the latest medical technology of the time. Highly skilled surgeons, capable of performing complex operations, worked on board. Iwo Jima became a testing ground for new methods of treating combat injuries. One such breakthrough was the widespread use of blood transfusions directly on the battlefield. Donated blood, prepared in advance and delivered to the island, allowed for compensation of massive blood loss and saved lives that would have previously been doomed. Antibiotics, particularly penicillin, also played a key role. For the first time, they were used on such a large scale, significantly reducing the risk of infections, which were previously the main cause of death from wounds. Open fractures, gunshot wounds, extensive burns. All these injuries, which just a few years earlier were considered fatal, now yielded to treatment thanks to new drugs. The statistics of the wounded on Iwo Jima were horrific. Of approximately 70,000 American Marines who landed on the island, about 19,000 were wounded, and nearly 6,800 died. This meant that almost every third Marine was incapacitated. However, thanks to the heroic efforts of the medics, the survival rate among the wounded was significantly higher than in previous campaigns. Methods of rescue in extreme conditions included not only medical innovations, but also incredible ingenuity. For example, When stretchers were scarce, the wounded were carried on tarpaulins, blankets, or even on doors from broken jeeps. Medics worked around the clock, without sleep or rest, often forgetting about their own safety. Their actions, their heroism, became one of the most striking examples of human compassion and courage in the midst of utter hell. On Iwo Jima, where the ground fighting turned into a merciless meat grinder, the sky above the island played an equally dramatic role. Aviation, seemingly omnipotent, faced unique challenges dictated by the ingenious Japanese defense. Long before the Marines landed, American aircraft from aircraft carriers and B-29 bombers based in the Mariana Islands launched a massive air campaign. For 72 days preceding the landing, Iwo Jima was subjected to continuous bombardment. Thousands of tons of bombs rained down on the island, transforming its surface into a cratered lunar landscape. The purpose of these preliminary strikes was to destroy Japanese fortifications, artillery positions, and suppress resistance. However, as we already know, General Kuribayashi was prepared for this. His deeply echeloned underground bunkers and tunnels proved surprisingly resilient to airstrikes. Bombs falling on the surface only shifted tons of volcanic ash and destroyed external structures. The main part of the Japanese defense remained untouched, hidden underground. Aviation could not reach these invisible fortresses. After the landing, the role of aviation changed. Now the main task was direct support of ground forces. Attack aircraft and fighter bombers, taking off from aircraft carrier decks, patrolled the sky over Iwo Jima, attacking detected Japanese positions. They dropped napalm bombs, strafed with machine guns and cannons, trying to suppress the firing points that hindered the advance of the Marines. The effectiveness of such support was variable. Against open positions, troop concentrations, or unarmored vehicles, aviation worked brilliantly. But when it came to well-camouflaged bunkers or firing points located in crevices, even the most accurate strikes often proved powerless. Japanese soldiers, like ghosts, emerged from underground, opened fire, and disappeared again, leaving pilots bewildered. However, despite limited success against underground fortifications, aviation played a crucial role in one key aspect. It provided constant air cover, preventing Japanese aircraft based on other islands from interfering in the battle for Iwo Jima. This provided American Marines with relative safety from air attacks. Iwo Jima was not just a target for bombing, it was a salvation. By March 6th, despite ongoing fighting, the first airfield was sufficiently cleared and repaired to receive aircraft. And so, on March 11, 1945, something happened that forever entered the history of the battle. The first heavy B-29 bomber, Dina Mike, made an emergency landing on Iwo Jima, returning from a raid on Japan with a damaged engine and a seriously wounded crew. Others followed. Throughout the battle, and especially after its end, the airfields of Iwo Jima became a real lifeline for hundreds of damaged B-29s and thousands of their pilots returning from bombing Japan. Without this intermediate base, many of them would have been doomed to perish in the ocean. According to some estimates, thanks to Iwo Jima, more than 2,250 bombers and more than 24,000 crew members were saved. This number eloquently speaks of the strategic importance of capturing the island. The sky over Iwo Jima saw both the hell of bombings and desperate attempts to support ground forces, and the triumph of salvation, which became a symbol of why this battle was so necessary. Against the backdrop of this hell, where every day was a struggle for survival, the Japanese soldiers were not going to surrender without a fight. Their tactics of resistance were imbued with the spirit of Bushido, the ancient samurai code of honor, which prescribed loyalty to the emperor, contempt for death, and refusal to surrender. General Kuribayashi, though an innovator in defensive tactics, could not entirely ignore this deeply ingrained mentality. He organized several counterattacks, but they were carefully planned and had specific objectives, rather than being senseless, suicidal sorties, as was often the case in other battles of the Pacific theater. These counterattacks were typically carried out at night, when darkness gave the Japanese an advantage. They aimed to break through American lines, inflict maximum damage, and create panic. Sometimes they succeeded. One of the largest and most desperate was the night attack from March 8th to 9th. About 1,000 Japanese soldiers, using their knowledge of the terrain and tunnels, managed to break through American lines in the area of the first airfield. It was a fierce, bloody, hand-to-hand fight with knives and bayonets. American Marines had to exert incredible effort to repel this onslaught. Ultimately, the Japanese were repulsed, but this attack showed how desperately they were willing to fight. In addition to organized counterattacks, so-called banzai charges constantly occurred on Iwo Jima, desperate, often suicidal sorties by small groups of Japanese soldiers. These attacks had no strategic significance but exerted enormous psychological pressure on the Americans. Japanese soldiers, emerging from their shelters, yelling, "Banzai!" meaning 10,000 years to the emperor, would rush at American positions, often armed only with bayonets or grenades. They did not expect victory. Their goal was to die with honor, taking as many enemies with them as possible. The Bushido Code prescribed death to a warrior, not the shame of captivity. For a Japanese soldier, surrender was unthinkable, disgraceful. This explains why, out of nearly 21,000 Japanese soldiers defending Iwo Jima, only slightly more than 200 were taken prisoner. Most of them were wounded and unable to resist. Many Japanese soldiers preferred to commit suicide, using grenades or their own bayonets, rather than fall into enemy hands. This fanaticism and refusal to surrender became one of the most shocking aspects of the battle for the Americans. They were facing an enemy who did not recognize the rules of war customary in the Western world. This not only bred respect for the Japanese steadfastness, but also intensified the brutality of the fighting, turning the battle into a war of attrition. Every cave, every bunker had to be cleared to the last man, because no one expected a Japanese soldier to surrender. In this fight to the last breath, where life was not valued as highly as honor, Japanese soldiers demonstrated incredible courage and absolute devotion to their homeland and emperor. General Kuribayashi, as we recall, led his soldiers in desperate resistance until his last breath. His final days were filled not only with hopeless struggle, but also with a profound understanding that his garrison was doomed. Documents and testimonies from that time paint a picture of a man who, despite the utter hopelessness of the situation, maintained clarity of mind and steadfastness of spirit. He issued orders that left no room for retreat or surrender, yet were aimed at the most effective use of remaining forces. Kuribayashi, realizing he had lost contact with most of his units, continued to coordinate the defense, relying on reports from rare messengers and his own intuitive understanding of the situation. His philosophy of resistance was not about victory, but about maximally exhausting the enemy, striving to make the price of victory for the Americans unbearably high. Every American life, every lost piece of equipment was to be a contribution to prolonging the war and perhaps to saving the Japanese homeland from invasion. He understood that his mission was a suicide mission, but believed that this sacrifice would not be in vain. On March 21, 1945, when the Americans already controlled most of the island, Kuribayashi sent his last radio message to Tokyo. In it, he apologized for not being able to hold the island, and expressed his boundless devotion to the emperor and the country. He concluded with the words, "I will not sleep peacefully until the Americans pay for this land." It was a farewell full of dignity and tragedy. By this time, Japanese forces were fragmented into small groups, trapped in the last, deepest tunnels and caves on the northern tip of the island. General Kuribayashi was in one of the last command bunkers, surrounded by a handful of loyal officers and soldiers. He refused the traditional seppuku suicide, believing that his duty was to fight to the end with his men. On March 26, 1945, the night before the official announcement of the end of the battle, Kuribayashi launched a final, desperate counterattack. Gathering about 300 of the last surviving soldiers, including medics and the wounded, he led them in an assault on the American camp. With shouts of "Banzai!" they rushed at the unsuspecting Americans. It was a fierce, bloody skirmish that lasted several hours. The circumstances of the general's death are still debated. Some testimonies indicate that he was killed in hand-to-hand combat, personally leading the attack. Others say that he may have committed suicide when he realized that all was lost. His body was never found, which only added to the tragedy and legendary status of his figure. Kuribayashi's death marked the end of organized resistance on Iwo Jima. He fulfilled his duty to the end, forcing the Americans to pay an incredibly high price for this small piece of land. His strategy and personal courage made him one of the most respected adversaries for American Marines. The battle, which was supposed to last a few days, stretched for 36, becoming one of the bloodiest in the history of the U.S. Marine Corps. Iwo Jima, a small volcanic island, became the arena for one of the most brutal and bloody battles in human history. Now that we have traced the path from the landing to the last days of General Kuribayashi's heroic resistance, it is time to look at the dry but terrifying figures that reveal the true cost of this victory. The statistics of casualties on Iwo Jima are striking in their clarity and make one reflect on the scale of human tragedy. For the American side, which was on the offensive, the losses were colossal. Approximately 6,821 men were killed in action or died of wounds. These were Marines, soldiers, and sailors who gave their lives for this small piece of land. The number of wounded was even greater. Almost 19,217 men sustained injuries of varying severity. Many of them were left disabled for life. The total number of American casualties, killed and wounded, exceeded 26,000 people. This meant that almost 1 in 3 of the 70,000 Marines who participated in the landing was put out of action. Such a casualty ratio was unprecedented for American forces in the Pacific theater of operations. Compare this to other major battles. For example, during the Battle of Okinawa, which lasted much longer and was significantly larger in scale, American casualties were higher in absolute numbers, but the ratio of killed to wounded and the total number of casualties relative to the strength of the forces involved was lower. On Iwo Jima, however, in a small area, the concentration of fatalities was incredibly high. The Japanese side, as expected, suffered even more terrible losses. Of approximately 21,000 men comprising the Iwo Jima garrison, almost 18,779 perished. Only 216 men were taken prisoner, most of whom were severely wounded and unable to resist. This eloquently speaks of the fanatical resistance of the Japanese soldiers, their readiness to fight to the last breath, without surrendering. The casualty ratio was horrific. For every American killed, there were almost 3 Japanese killed. However, considering that American forces were on the offensive and the Japanese were defending well-fortified positions, this ratio underscores the exceptional brutality and intensity of the fighting. The duration of the battle, 36 days, was also significantly longer than the American command had anticipated. These 36 days were filled with continuous, exhausting battles, in which every meter of ground had to be gained with immense difficulty. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commander of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, later uttered a phrase that became one of the most famous quotes about the Battle of Iwo Jima. "Uncommon valor was a common virtue." These words not only pay tribute to the courage of the American Marines, but also acknowledge the incredible steadfastness and self-sacrifice of the Japanese defenders. Nimitz, more than anyone else, understood the price both sides paid for this tiny piece of land. He saw how American soldiers, despite horrifying losses and inhumane conditions, continued to advance, fulfilling their duty. He also recognized that the Japanese, fighting to the last bullet, to the last man, displayed exceptional courage, albeit in a hopeless situation. The Battle of Iwo Jima became a symbol not only of heroism, but also of immense human tragedy. It was a battle where every survivor bore the imprint of the hell they had endured, and every fallen soldier became part of the incredible price that had to be paid for victory. But what did this victory yield? What impact did it have on the further course of the war? We will discuss this next time. The Battle of Iwo Jima ended, leaving behind only ashes and thousands of lives. But this bloody victory was not an end in itself. It became a strategic springboard that changed the course of the war in the Pacific. The capture of Iwo Jima was of colossal importance for subsequent United States operations, and its impact can hardly be overestimated. The main and most obvious advantage was the airfields. The 3 runways, for which the Marines paid such a high price, were immediately put into operation. Iwo Jima became a vital intermediate base for B-29 bombers conducting raids on the Japanese islands. Before the capture of Iwo Jima, these flying fortresses flew at the limit of their range from the Mariana Islands. Any damage, any engine malfunction meant inevitable death in the boundless waters of the Pacific Ocean. Crews who managed to reach Iwo Jima got a second chance at life. Hundreds of planes, damaged by Japanese anti-aircraft defenses or fighters, were able to make emergency landings on Iwo Jima, saving not only expensive equipment, but also thousands of American pilots. According to some reports, thanks to Iwo Jima, more than 2,250 bombers and more than 24,000 crew members were saved. These are not just numbers. These are 24,000 families who did not receive death notices, 24,000 lives that continued. It was here, on Iwo Jima, that thousands of pilots found salvation, received medical care, and returned to duty. This small island became a true beacon of hope in the midst of an ocean of war. In addition, Iwo Jima's airfields became a base for long-range fighters such as the P-51 Mustang. These fighters could escort B-29 bombers all the way to Japan, providing them with vital cover from Japanese interceptors. This significantly reduced losses among bomber aircraft and allowed for an increase in the intensity of raids on Japanese cities and industrial facilities. Bombings became more accurate and destructive, undermining Japan's military potential and the morale of its population. The impact of the battle on the planning of the invasion of the Japanese islands was no less significant. The horrific losses on Iwo Jima and then on Okinawa, where the Japanese also offered fanatical resistance, forced the American command to reconsider their plans. They understood that a direct invasion of the main Japanese islands, Operation Downfall, would result in unthinkable losses. According to military analysts, losses could range from 500,000 to 1 million American soldiers, not to mention millions of Japanese. These grim predictions, based on the experience of Iwo Jima, played a key role in the adoption of one of the most tragic and controversial decisions in history: the use of atomic weapons. The United States leadership, faced with the prospect of a protracted and incredibly bloody war, sought to find a way to quickly and decisively end the conflict. The development of the atomic bomb, which until this moment had been kept in strict secrecy, was now seen as the only way to avoid a large-scale invasion and save millions of lives, both American and Japanese. Iwo Jima, with all its brutality and unprecedented losses, became a formidable warning of what awaited Americans on Japanese soil. It showed that the Japanese were ready to fight to the last man, to the last breath, and that their will to resist was not broken. This experience, along with the experience of Okinawa, convinced the American leadership of the need to find an alternative path to victory. Thus, a small volcanic island, lost in the Pacific Ocean, became not only a symbol of heroism and tragedy, but also one of the factors that influenced the decision that forever changed the world. After the guns fell silent and the smoke cleared over Iwo Jima, the island did not vanish from memory. On the contrary, it became forever etched into the historical fabric of two nations, serving as a symbol of both unspeakable tragedy and gradual, but inevitable, reconciliation. The post-war history of this volcanic patch of land is a story of healing wounds, of transforming a battlefield into a place of remembrance. Years after the war ended, the island, which the Japanese call Iwo To, became a sacred place for both sides. Here, amidst the black ash and shell-scarred rocks, memorials were created dedicated to the fallen. American Marines erected monuments to their comrades, and the Japanese to their defenders. These memorials, simple and majestic, became pilgrimage sites for veterans and their descendants. Particularly touching were the joint American-Japanese memorial ceremonies that began to be held on the island. The first such meetings were filled with awkwardness and pain. But with each passing year, they became increasingly sincere. A veteran who once fought against another veteran now stood side by side, bowing his head in silent respect for their shared losses. These ceremonies, often held to the piercing sound of bagpipes and traditional Japanese instruments, symbolize not just peace, but deep reconciliation. Veteran organizations, both American and Japanese, actively contributed to this process. They organized trips to Iwo Jima, meetings of former adversaries where people who once tried to kill each other now exchanged memories, shared pain, and found solace in shared grief. These meetings were often accompanied by tears, but these were tears not of hatred, but of understanding and forgiveness. Gradually, Iwo Jima ceased to be merely a battleground. It became a place where people realized the absurdity of war and the value of peace. The Battle of Iwo Jima left an indelible mark not only on the hearts of veterans, but also on the culture of both countries. In the United States, one of the most powerful symbols became the famous Marine Corps Memorial in Washington, known as the Iwo Jima Memorial. It recreates Joe Rosenthal's legendary photograph, capturing the flag raising on Mount Suribachi. This monument, vacant and emotional, became an embodiment of the courage and sacrifice of American Marines, a reminder of the price of freedom. However, the cultural understanding of the battle was not limited to one side. Hollywood films such as Clint Eastwood's Diptych, Flags of Our Fathers, and Letters from Iwo Jima offered the world a unique perspective on this battle from two sides. Flags of Our Fathers showed the battle through the eyes of American soldiers, and Letters from Iwo Jima through the eyes of Japanese defenders, including General Kuribayashi. These films were an important step towards understanding that on both sides of the front, there were people with their fears, hopes, and loyalties. They helped break down stereotypes and show the complexity of the human experience of war. Iwo Jima appears in countless books, documentaries, songs, and works of art, each time making us reflect on the nature of conflict, on heroism, and the value of human life. It became not just a historical event, but a metaphor for resilience, sacrifice, and, ultimately, reconciliation. The significance of the battle for historical memory and military history is hard to overestimate. Iwo Jima is not just a page in a textbook. It is a living reminder of how terrible war is, and how important it is to remember the lessons of the past. It is a reminder that even in the most bloody conflicts, a path to understanding and peace can be found. Iwo Jima, an island of fire and ashes, has transformed into a beacon of hope, showing that even the deepest wounds can heal, and yesterday's enemies can find common ground in their shared humanity.